Welcome back, warriors. Kwe Tansei Sego. My name is Pam Palmater, and welcome to my YouTube channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to help us protect our peoples and the planet. By now, you have seen all of the solidarity actions all over Turtle Island. Indigenous peoples and Canadians standing together to demand for justice for the Wetsuweten Nation. Since my last video explaining the RCMP raid in Wetsuweten territory, I have received lots of emails and social media messages asking me to address information you hear in the media. In today's video, I'll try to sort through some of the misinformation and political distractions and focus on the factual answers to your questions. So stay tuned to hear more. Video, I'll try to answer some of your questions about the RCMP invasion in Wetsuweten territory and all of the Indigenous solidarity actions around Canada that arose as a result. In case you missed my previous video explaining the background of the RCMP invasion, I'll post a link to it below so that you can catch up. But here's a quick review. What we know is that Coastal GasLink Pipeline is a subsidiary of TransCanada and is trying to build a pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory without the free, prior and informed consent of the whole nation. The pipeline company decided to go around the hereditary leaders and secure impact benefit agreements with some of the Indigenous band councils and ignore the eviction order that was issued by the hereditary leaders. Coastal GasLink Pipeline then went to court to get an injunction to allow them to proceed with construction of the pipeline, and acting on that injunction, the RCMP invaded Wet'suwet'en territory and forcibly removed Wet'suwet'en peoples from their homes. Although the RCMP prohibited journalists from covering the forced removals, there were enough pictures and videos from inside the camps to see the RCMP with heavy machinery, helicopters, and heavily armed officers. These actions, which clearly breached human rights, freedom of the press, and Indigenous rights, is what has inspired nationwide actions in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. Ever since then, there have been a literal mess of media coverage about this situation, with governments and industry trying to deliberately control and confuse the message. Thankfully, Canadians know to look beyond the headlines and do their own research and ask their own questions. So today I'm going to try to answer 6 of the most popular questions that I get. And the first question is, what's this rule of law that everyone keeps talking about? Well, in general, it's a principle that states that peoples and institutions are subject to the laws that are fairly applied and fairly enforced in a country. You can see in this definition where problems start to arise for Canada. First of all, laws in Canada are not applied equally as between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, which is why we have such high incarceration rates of Indigenous peoples, sexual and racial discrimination in the Indian Act against Indigenous women, and many other injustices. Secondly, the protections in law that are meant to provide everyone with protections are not extended to First Nations children, which has resulted in higher rates of First Nation kids in care, or Indigenous women and girls, which is why there's thousands of murdered and missing. Thirdly, this principle would apply to all the laws in Canada, Indigenous laws, human rights laws, and international laws. Failing to respect the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples or forcibly removing them from their territories is a gross violation of the rule of law. Finally, I would also add that a law is not lawful simply because it's been enacted. The worst atrocities have been committed under unlawful laws like scalping bounties, residential school laws, and the forced sterilizations of Indigenous women and girls. Genocide is acknowledged as the highest crime that can be committed in the world, and Canada is a state perpetrator of genocide, not just historically, but ongoing. Canada picks and chooses which laws it applies and to whom and when, and it tends to suit corporate interests over those of people. Your second question is, what about the 20 First Nations who consented to the pipeline? Well, this is a really good question, especially because this is the answer that government officials and the pipeline commentators keep saying as their primary defense for the RCMP invasion. In law, however, it doesn't matter if 100 First Nations consent to a pipeline in their territories. They have no legal jurisdiction or authority to make decisions about lands in other Indigenous territories. But government and industry know this. They just hope that if they play the numbers game and Canadians don't know the law, they can pull the wool over your eyes. Aboriginal rights are specific to each Indigenous nation and are defined within the borders of that nation's traditional territory. Only that nation has the right to decide what does and doesn't happen on their lands, often referred to as Aboriginal title. This numbers game is used to suggest widespread support, but we don't know if the people in those First Nations consented, if they have traditional governments and whether they consented under their respective Indigenous laws and processes for that matter, or what the contents of those agreements actually say. And your third question, but wait, didn't the First Nations that make up the Wetsuweten Nation sign impact benefit agreements consenting to the pipeline? That's another great question, because it raises the related question of what are the legal authorities of Indian Act band councils versus traditional forms of government like the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders. In this particular case, the Indian Act Band Council's legislative jurisdiction under the Indian Act is very limited in terms of scope and territory, and their authority does not extend beyond the reserve boundaries. The pipeline doesn't cross reserve lands, so it doesn't matter if the band councils consented, but we have no idea because we haven't seen the agreements. In the special case of the Wet'suwet'en, it is the hereditary leaders who hold authority under Wet'suwet'en law to make decisions about their traditional territory. The leaders have said no to any pipelines on their territory. They have issued an eviction order for Coastal GasLink pipeline to leave, and they have recently reconfirmed that eviction order. Remember, it was the hereditary leaders representing all of their clans and houses that went to the Supreme Court of Canada in Delgamuukw to prove their Aboriginal title claims, not the band councils. That is not to say that one is better than the other, or one is good, or one is evil. It's just the legal reality of who has authority and who doesn't. I should also note that an impact benefit agreement does not necessarily mean consent. Aside from the legal issue about whether the band council has authority to sign it, there is also the issue of duress. When First Nations are told they have no choice, that the pipeline will be built no matter what, and they're threatened with arrest if they refuse, there's really no room in there to refuse, at least not without severe consequences. That's what's called duress. And in the law, if there's duress, that can vitiate or void any kind of consent. Now your fourth question is, but isn't there a division in the nation? I thought I heard a woman in the media saying she agrees with the pipeline. Well, I don't speak for the Wet'suwet'en Nation, so you would have to ask them directly about how they feel. But in my conversations with Wet'suwet'en leaders and spokespeople, they explain that a difference of opinion is not a division. It's a natural part of any society, no better or no worse than any other family, community, city, or province in the country. So here's the thing. If there's no agreement on the pipeline, then there can be no consent for the pipeline. So this argument doesn't help Coastal GasLink pipeline. It only serves to reinforce that they did not get free, prior, and informed consent of the nation according to Wet'suwet'en laws and decision-making processes. Yes, the media will always be able to find someone that holds a different opinion. That's the nature of the media. But I am told that the hereditary leaders representing their clans and houses have consistently been against pipelines in their territories. What we can't do as outsiders, whether we're First Nations or Canadians, is substitute our views, ideas, beliefs, and ideologies for those of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. They are a sovereign nation. They're entitled to have differing opinions. They're entitled to agree and disagree on any issue they want to, and they are entitled to say no to the pipeline. What we know for sure is that the hereditary leaders representing hundreds of clan members have legal jurisdiction over their lands in question, and they have said no to the pipeline. They've tried to dialogue with Coastal Gas and told them to reroute the pipeline, but Coastal Gas refused to even consider those accommodations. So, the province had no right to issue the permit to the pipeline, and the RCMP had no right to remove them from their homes. The fifth question is, are these solidarity actions dangerous? Absolutely not. all of these solidarity actions have been done peacefully. They are meant to draw attention to the RCMP invasion and continued occupation of Wetsuweten territory and the urgent need for government to respect their right to decide what happens on their lands according to their own laws, governing systems, and decision-making processes. Every single person I know that's involved in organizing or participating in the solidarity actions supporting the Wetsuweten have all wanted to honor the Wetsuweten and would never take actions that would hurt the cause. They have all organized peaceful events. It tends to only be industry or government that make claims about illegal activities or Canadians turning against us or risk of conflict and violence. Some of them even make bold claims about telling the police to rush in there and arrest everyone, or that Canada's economy is on the brink of collapse. These are all fear-mongering tactics meant to scare people and divide us. Remember Idle No More? There were thousands of solidarity events all over Canada by thousands of people for many months. They were all peaceful. And whether we were round dancing in the streets, occupying railways or legislatures, they were all done peacefully. Everyone is simply trying to push governments to finally take action. And yes, some of these actions might cause temporary inconvenience or temporary disruptions in our everyday lives. But genocide has been pretty devastating for Indigenous peoples and has been ongoing for decades. Our peoples are murdered and missing by the thousands, overrepresented in foster care, humanitarian crisis, and over-incarcerated. We have the highest poverty rates in Canada and some of the highest suicide rates in the world. Nothing is going to change unless we take a big, bold push and make governments change. Everything that we are doing is how societies go about bringing positive change. No rights have ever been given to peoples, whether it's women's rights, the Black rights movement, or Native rights. Human rights have to consistently be fought for. Together, Indigenous peoples and Canadians can fight the good fight together in peace to ensure justice and human rights for all of us. And your last question should be no surprise. So what is the solution? And that's probably the best question of all. We know that the cause of this situation is the continued failure of governments to address Native sovereignty and land rights. And we also know that Canada is guilty of genocide and is failing to address it. So the solution flows directly from the problems. Wet'suwet'en want the RCMP off of their territories and have asked for nation-to-nation discussions about their land rights. There are hundreds of solidarity actions across the country supporting this request. Even the United Nations told Canada to stand down, remove the RCMP, and freeze all major projects until they get free, prior, and informed consent. Why? Because that's the law. That's the rule of law in this territory. It also seems to me that the solution is literally right in front of their faces. All that's missing is the political will, and that's where you all come in. When Canadians and Indigenous people stand together in solidarity, that pushes political will. We can push governments to do what they should have done decades ago and finally address our land rights. Thank you all for standing in support of the Wet'suwet'en. Your support makes a huge difference. Governments will move from even the most immovable positions when they see that Canadians care and stand with us. Thank you also to the Wet'suwet'en Nation. Your determination to defend your traditional laws and governing process and protect your territories has literally inspired the rest of us. Thank you for your sacrifices and leadership. I hope you all found this video helpful. I know that you had tons of other questions and I will do my best to get to them in future videos. I hope you all make the time to check out the Unistoten and Gidimt'en websites and use their supporter toolkits to find the many ways that you can help. Thank you for watching my channel. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing and sharing these videos with your family, friends, colleagues, and social justice allies. If you want additional resources, you can always check out my website, www.pampalmater.com. Till next time, stay alert, warriors. We need you.